For this fourth installment of the series on reviewing a client's estate plan, we're going to dive more into the concept of class gifts and how you can define a class and determine how much goes to each member of that class if a distribution or transfer is triggered. This is a presentation and series that's designed for attorneys, wealth advisors, and tax advisors who deal with estate planning issues as part of their practice, but this is not intended to be a self-help resource for consumers of legal information who might be working on their own estate plan. So this video cannot be relied upon to assess the health of your own estate plan. Hi, my name is Griffin Bridgers, and it's my pleasure to introduce Part 4 of reviewing a client's estate plan, with a focus on class gifts. As always, I want to remind you that this presentation is not intended to substitute for legal or tax advice, and this video cannot be relied upon to assess the health of your own estate plan. So, in this series, we've covered several things that go into reviewing an estate plan. First and foremost was titling and beneficiary designations in Part 1, a roadmap of basic, intermediate, and advanced documents in Part 2, and then an intro to wills, which are often the cornerstone of estate plans, in Part 3. So today we're going to dive into class gifts a bit, because class gifts are going to apply amongst all these documents we've talked about so far that deal with disposition of property, either during life or at the time of death. So the results we're looking at after this presentation will be that after listening to this, one, you'll be able to determine how classes are defined among a lot of testamentary or transfer types of interest that are used in estate planning. And also, you'll be able to determine how property is divided among class members. Now I'm going to pepper in some language that might be used in a number of transfer instruments, but to start with, it's important to note what transfer instruments we're dealing with. Generally, any instrument that disposes of property, whether it's a will or a trust, or even a beneficiary designation, might refer to a class. Most often, the most commonly used class is the descendants, maybe, of the transferor. So that would usually include their blood descendants, so children, grandchildren, etc. But it could also include maybe adopted individuals, as we'll see a little bit later on. So for example, you might have language in an instrument that says, I give my property to my descendants by representation. That's perhaps the simplest form. Now, it may also be the case that, especially if you don't have any descendants, you might have a closed class, whether related or unrelated, of individuals. So the wording is a little bit more difficult there. You have to be a lot more intentional about not only who is in the class, but what happens if one of them fails to survive or outlive the person making the transfer. So for example, here's some legalese you might find around this. I give my property in equal shares to the living members of the group consisting of John Smith, Jane Smith, and Dan Smith, provided, however, that if any of such beneficiaries predeceases me, that beneficiary's share shall be distributed to their descendants by representation, or if such beneficiary predeceases me and does not have any living descendants, the beneficiary's share shall be allocated proportionately among the shares for the other beneficiaries and or their respective descendants by representation. So within a class like this, often what you have to deal with is what's known as lapse language. What happens if a beneficiary doesn't outlive the person making the transfer? One option is that their share lapses and maybe goes to the other individuals in the class, or maybe just passes on to the other beneficiaries named under the instrument. Another possibility is that maybe their share lapses, but only within the class itself, and is then allocated proportionally among the other members of the class. And you might also go a bit further to say, hey, if a member of the class predeceases me, their share goes to their descendants. If you want, say, a family friend's descendants to benefit under your will or your trust or a beneficiary designation. But that aside, the big question with any class is whether and to what extent it's set at the time that an instrument is signed, or can it expand after the instrument is signed? So most often, descendants is a pretty loaded term, but it often captures unborn descendants, especially in second and third generations, because it's intended that, yeah, you have children now when you're setting up a document, but maybe down the road they'll have their own children, their grandchildren, and so on and so forth. So the question is, do you want to include them? Most often the answer will be yes, but also if you have any future children of your own that are born after you create the instrument, should they be included as well? And that might be important, for example, with an irrevocable trust that you can't really amend or change the terms of. So a couple examples of this you might have would be, one, if you're older and want to cut off children, you might say, for purposes of my will, my children shall include my above-named children only. If you have that type of language, future born children or future adopted children won't be included in that version of your will. A counterexample might be if you say, for purposes of my will, my children shall include my above-named children as well as any children subsequently born to or legally adopted by me. That type of language would open up that class at that first generation level to say, hey, any future born children will be included as well as their lineal descendants as well. So the big thing is that with a closed class, whether it's among your children in that first example, or maybe among unrelated individuals as we saw in the last slide, that first line or generation of beneficiaries usually won't expand, but their descendants, if they're contingent beneficiaries, could expand. So you're really only looking at expansion on one level. If you want to close it across the board, you have to be express and explicit about that. And it becomes a little bit more difficult to determine whether that's accurate. So in most cases, too, I think it's important to note, this is a common misconception, which I'm going to emphasize a couple times. Classes typically never include spouses of class members unless the instrument says so. So if you make a gift to, say, your descendants, then a spouse of a descendant who is deceased is never going to inherit their share unless you expressly state that in the instrument. So I want to emphasize again, classes never include the spouses of class members unless the instrument says otherwise. Now, with that being said, it's also important to dig to who is the root of the class, who's the individual that determines where the class starts, because that could start it at many different points on the family tree. So for example, is it limited to maybe descendants of an individual beneficiary, or do you go up the family tree maybe to descendants of the drafter of the instrument, or maybe up or out on the family tree to say descendants of a family member of the drafter of the instrument? So there's a couple examples, actually 3 examples here. One might be, for example, this power of appointment might be exercised in favor of settlor's descendants. So that means the descendants of the person creating a trust. Another example might be at the beneficiary's death, the balance of their share will be distributed to their descendants by representation, or if none, to my descendants by representation. So that starts with a smaller class, often individual beneficiary, and only goes to a bigger class off the creator of the instrument if there's no descendants under the beneficiary. Then finally, you might look at my spouse's death. My spouse might have the power of appoint the balance of the marital trust to or among the descendants of my grandparents, but not my spouse's descendants who are not also descendants of my grandparents. So for example, this one would make sure that not only does the spouse only have a limited benefit under a trust, but it keeps the spouse from directing assets to their own future born descendants, or their descendants maybe from a prior marriage that are merely stepchildren of the person creating the instrument here. But either way, that's the more difficult part. What's more fun, because we get into visual representation, is when we talk about methods of division among class members. Now, states vary widely on this. They have several different terms. There's different ways to do this, but really what we're going to look at is the top of the bell curve. What are the most commonly used methods to determine how much goes to each member of the class? So there's a couple. The most commonly used one by far, I think, is by representation or per Stirpes. Those are phrases that are interchangeable. They mean the same thing. This has the widest usage, and really the crux of this is that it analyzes distributions and breaks them down equally by family unit at each applicable generation. And it really, at the end, what we're going to see is this disfavors family units with more descendants than others. Then, there's a typo here. This should say per capita at each generation and not per capital. But this is a distribution scheme that instead analyzes distributions by generation and not by family units. Ultimately, this is going to disfavor family units with fewer descendants when compared to others with more descendants. So we'll see how this is illustrated out. So first, we have per Stirpes or by representation to descendants. Now, note again, spouses of descendants never benefit under the class definition of descendants. So we have the transferor here at the top. We have first generation, 4 children, 3 of which are deceased, and 2 of which actually leave living descendants, and 1 of which does not. Then we have child 1 who's living. So what happens is you have to break this down first by how many family units are represented here. So in the case of child 3 is deceased and has no grandchildren, so there's no family unit there to give any property to. So essentially you have 3 family units, child 1, child 2, and child 4. So amongst all those family units, you take the property and divide it by 3 family units so that 1/3 as a share goes to each family unit. Now in the case of child 2, their 1/3 will pass on to their children, which are the grandchildren of the transferor. We see that child 2 has 5 children/grandchildren. So essentially their 1/3 share will get further divided by 5 and go equally to each of those living grandchildren. In child 4's case, same thing. They have a 1/3 share for their family unit, but it passes on to their grandchildren, and it goes in equal shares as 1/3 divided by 2. So they each get 1/6 essentially. So as you can see, the grandchildren in child 4's family unit are each going to get more than the grandchildren in child 2's family unit. So once again, I want to emphasize that per Stirpes or by representation disfavors the family unit that has more living descendants than the one that has fewer living descendants. But again, if child is deceased and has no living descendants, there's no family unit there to give anything to. And that's why we don't divide by 4 here. Since we take out child 3, there's no family unit. Everything else is then divided amongst the other family units. Compare that to per capita by generation to the transferor's descendants. We have the same setup here, but now instead of looking at family units where 1/3 goes on, we first determine not by family unit, but by representatives who are living in the first generation. And we see that there could be 3 potential family units here with takers. So we still have a 1/3 analysis, and child 1 still gets a 1/3 share. Their grandchild gets nothing until child 1 is deceased. But now the difference comes with the grandchildren in the child 2 family unit and the grandchildren in the child 4 family unit. Because what we now do is take the remaining 2/3 that passes down, and instead of dividing that by family unit, we divide that by living members of that generation. So there's 7 total grandchildren, and we're going to take 2/3, the amount passing on from the first generation, and divide that by 7. So essentially, each grandchildren is going to get 2/3 divided by 7, whatever that might be. I'm not going to do the math here, but what that means is that with child 2's family unit, each grandchild is going to get more than they would have under per Stirpes or by representation. But in the case of child 4's family unit, each grandchild will get less than they would have under per Stirpes or by representation. So that's a quick graphical representation of how we do this. And like I said, more often the most commonly used one is per Stirpes or by representation. But if you have a client that has maybe a number of grandchildren in one family unit as compared to the others, you might want to talk about per capita by generation to see if that's a better fit. So the big question over all this is, why class gifts? Why do we want to look at this? And this isn't intended to be an all-inclusive analysis or a definitive rubric of what goes into this question and why we might use this, but there's a few key things at the top of the bell curve to close us out today. For one, it creates certainty, because it's hard to challenge the validity of an individual's right to inherit or benefit, especially if they're not identified by name. It's easy to say, okay, my descendants benefit, that's natural, so everybody should get their proportionate share based on the per Stirpes or per capita distribution. The only thing that could really be challenged there by the other beneficiaries is just simply class inclusion, which is virtually impossible with a blood relative. More often where you see that is in the case of adoption, especially adult adoption, which is why a lot of wills, trusts, and other instruments might cut off adoption at, say, age 21 to determine who is actually validly a member of the class of descendants. Another reason is it creates equality. So this makes sure that each beneficiary, at least by generation, receives an equal share or a proportionate share by family unit. So it reduces the risk that individuals might go on to challenge the proportions that they inherit or benefit from under a testamentary or transfer instrument. Then finally, it creates flexibility, especially for irrevocable types of documents like irrevocable trusts, because it allows later born individuals or even unknown individuals to benefit without the need to update an instrument. So for example, if you're a grandparent setting up a grandchildren's trust, you might wonder if there's going to be more grandchildren born in the future, or you might have an estranged child and you don't want to benefit the estranged child, but you want to make sure their grandchildren can benefit, but you don't know who those grandchildren are. So you have that flexibility to include people without having to identify them by name at the time that you create the document itself. So those are the big picture items of why class gifts are beneficial. And as we talked about today, we've looked at what does a class consist of, how do you define it, and also how do you determine how much goes to each member of that class by common definition. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. As always, if you have questions or topic suggestions, you can email those to me at griffin.bridgers@gmail.com with the caveat that I cannot give legal or tax advice in response to your questions, and the other caveat again that this video cannot be relied upon as a self-help resource or to assess the health of your own estate plan. But thank you again for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in my future videos.